From the Central Policy Priorities, Tess Embry from the National Association of Housing Redevelopment Officials, Linda Couch from Leading Age, Steve Bird from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, Sarah Mickelson from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and Gabriel Dakota from Community. And this day, see, and it's a pre-packed agenda, so I would like to get going on it as soon as possible. Before we get into our agenda, I want to go over the budget appropriations. I'm going to sorry. Can I continue, Sarah? We'll give it one more minute. Sorry about that, folks. We'll give it one more second. Hey folks, sorry, we're gonna. Hi folks, we're in the midst of trying to MacGyver this situation. Please hang in there. So, as I was saying, sorry, I'm hearing feedback. Okay. Right. Sorry, folks, again. So the budget and appropriations timeline is very much in flux this year. The budget process is much slower than normal participation, and some of the budget machinations that they are trying to accomplish, healthcare or taxes, etc. So what this means, though, is that the appropriations committee has been delayed in getting their top line spending number that the budget committee gives them each year for how much they have to spend in discretionary spending. The House was expected to release a budget later this or later next month that would have the top line number, but that might slip. So what that means is that the appropriations committees might instead decide to move spending bills forward using a top line number that's at the fiscal year 18 spending caps. And those caps are in place because of the Budget Control Act. So they need to pass these bills by September 30th. If they don't do that, then they will have to rely on a continuing resolution because of the delays. And I know a lot of people are, focused on the Trump budget, and they've heard things that the budget might be dead on arrival, but it's still important that we can't ignore the proposals that are included in the Trump budget, even though Congress writes its own budget. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Doug Rice to give a budget outlook and speak about the impact of the Trump budget on housing vouchers.
Hi, everyone. Good to talk to you today. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes? Good. Okay, well, I'm going to just provide a quick overview of the broader context in which this Trump budget was released. As most of you know, we've been operating under Budget Control Act spending caps since 2011. These caps have been very stingy. There's separate caps for defense and non-defense programs. Policymakers, to their credit, and I should say thanks to the strong work of advocates around the country, policymakers have prioritized funding for housing assistance programs within these caps. But nonetheless, funding has been deeply cut over the last several years. President Trump has proposed to cut funding for non-defense programs far below the already stingy current law spending caps for non-defense programs. He's proposing specifically to cut $54 billion from the cap level in 2018 for non-defense discretionary programs. For HUD, that means a request of $40.7 billion for HUD programs overall, which is more than $7 billion below the 2017 level. That's about a 15% reduction. And to specify those cuts, his budget proposes really massive cuts in rental assistance and flexible grants of all kinds that would hurt families in many ways, as well as low-income communities more broadly. And my colleagues on this call are going to talk about these things separately. I just want to add one other thing. At the end of the day, to avoid further cuts in HUD programs in the future, and we really need to modify the Budget Control Act spending caps that are in place. And it's essential to tell policymakers, as you talk to them about how important these programs are in your local communities, to also communicate the necessity of raising the current law caps to free up more resources for these programs. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So a couple of pictures just to fill in what I've been talking about. There's a lot going on in this chart. The blue bars represent overall funding for non-defense discretionary programs relative to 2010, adjusted for inflation. And as you can see under the Budget Control Act caps, there have been really deep cuts, especially the first 3 years, 2011, 2012, 2013, and they've been moderated somewhat, but still we're far below the 2010 level. And also included on the chart is a fainter blue line showing the cap level for 2018, which would reduce the amount of total funding somewhat in inflation-adjusted terms. Compared to that are the orange bars, which represent funding for housing assistance programs, again, relative to 2010, adjusted for inflation. And as you can see, there have certainly been significant cuts in funding for these programs, but the cuts have not been as deep as the cuts overall for non-defense discretionary programs, which again reflects policymakers' efforts to prioritize funding for these programs under the very stingy caps. Next slide, please. And nonetheless, of course, there have been already substantial reductions in funding for a wide range of housing and community development programs. The deepest cuts have been in public housing and the major block grant programs, but there are cuts elsewhere too. Next slide, please. And just to give you another picture of where we are with the current law budget caps, as you can see, this shows non-defense funding adjusted for inflation, and the cap in 2018 is below the 2017 level there. So the current law caps are going to put us in a very tight position in 2018, even before the kinds of cuts that President Trump has proposed in his budget. Next slide, please. Whoops, my voucher slide disappeared. Okay, well, I don't know where my slide went, but I want to talk a minute about Housing Choice Vouchers, the largest rental assistance program. So the President's budget requests a bit over $17 billion to renew housing vouchers. That's close to $800 million below the 2017 level and well over $2 billion below the amount that will actually be needed to fully fund voucher renewals in 2018. And what that means is that under the Trump request, we estimate that housing vouchers for about 250,000 families would be eliminated in 2018. And up on our website, there are data that break down those potential losses by state if you're interested in that. The request also includes $1.6 billion for Housing Authority administrative fees. That's a reduction of about $100 million below the 2017 level. Agencies have already seen significant reductions in funding to do things like inspections to make sure units meet federal quality standards, to recertify income, to reduce errors and improve accuracy in payments and so on. This reduction would just make it even harder for them to do that work. Partly to offset the huge cuts that the budget includes for rental assistance programs, it also proposes a host of really radical rent policy changes, and I won't go into details, but it includes things like imposing mandatory minimum rents on the poorest tenants, increasing tenant contributions from 30% of income up to 35%. The net effect of these proposals would be to significantly raise rents on the poorest households. In the voucher, and I should make clear that these proposals eventually would apply to most HUD rental assistance programs, though there seems to be language in the budget suggesting it would be phased in if they're adopted, of course. In addition to raising rents on tenants in the voucher program, the effect of these proposals would be to sharply limit the housing options that families using vouchers have, and so really restrict them to neighborhoods in their communities where the rents are the absolute lowest, and limiting their access to neighborhoods where there may be better opportunities for jobs or higher quality schools and so on. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Doug, for that presentation. Next, we're going to hear from Linda Couch from Leading Age.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Doug. I'm going to dig into the request for project-based rental assistance. And given Doug's presentation, you won't be surprised to hear that the request from the Trump administration is insufficient to renew PBRA contracts that will come up for renewal in FY18. The request seeks $10.7 billion and the actual renewal need is about $11.4 billion. And the answer in the budget documents about how they're gonna renew all the contracts at 10.7 is that the budget, as Doug was explaining, includes the implementation of several cost-cutting measures. And it's important to understand that the budget also says that the policies, some of which Doug just outlined, are policies that the administration sees as a starting point as it works towards a more comprehensive package of rental assistance reforms. Next slide. So I just wanted to real quickly go over some of these nasty rental assistance reforms that are in the request. This first one is it's called a pilot for the Section 8 PBRA, Section 202, and Section 811 programs, but it appears to give the authority for HUD to use this latitude for all of its programs. And so this one would to increase tenant rent contributions to the greater of, to require housing authorities and owners to increase tenant rent contributions to the greater of 30% of adjusted income, which is of course the current standard for tenant contribution today, or 35% of gross income. So doing away with income exclusions that tenants take advantage of today to reduce their income for purposes of figuring out what their rent's going to be. So increasing rents by moving from the greater of 30% of adjusted income to a standard of 35% of gross income. Secondly, and really damaging for the Section 8, Section 202, and Section 811 programs, which rely on the participation of private landlords, is that there is a freeze in the HUD budget. There's a provision that would allow the HUD secretary to suspend project rent increases from HUD in FY18 for those three programs, PBRA, Section 202, and Section 811. These are the rent increases that properties normally get every year based on an annual adjustment factor or a budget-based rent increase or an updated market study. And these are part of the contract, part of the deal that HUD has made with these private owners. And HUD is saying that, we're asking for a one-year suspension of that part of the deal. Third is a proposal to eliminate utility reimbursements for tenants when those utility reimbursements would exceed minimum rents paid by families. Something that is going to impact, again, the lowest income residents. And then on the next slide, this proposal to require a $50 minimum rent in all housing programs. So right now, public housing authorities for their public housing and voucher units can have a $50 minimum rent, up to a $50 minimum rent. Many of them do, but many of them don't. Some of them have a $25 minimum rent. A few of them don't have a minimum rent at all. And for the project-based Section 8 program today, the existing authority has allowed the HUD secretary to set a minimum rent of up to $50. Years ago, I don't remember which HUD secretary set the PBRA minimum rent at $25. The proposal that's in the budget request would set a $50 minimum rent for all housing programs, including Section 202 and 811 programs. And for those programs that are subsidized not through Section 8 but through project rental assistance contracts, they don't currently have any minimum rent. And we've all gone through these minimum rent policy proposals before, so we know that by definition, a $50 minimum rent only impacts residents with incomes of less than $2,000 a year. So they're just running after the very, very lowest income residents for probably not a lot of money. On the next slide, real quickly on the 202 and 811 accounts, I guess what you need to know is that for the 202 account, HUD asks for a little bit more than the program received in 2017, which would be okay, but it's still completely insufficient to renew all the contracts that we know are going to come up for renewal next year. And then for the 811 account, they ask for a deep cut, a 17% cut compared to FY17, even though we know, and HUD knows, that another 1,000 units are going to be renewing next year for the first time. So the technical assistance collaborative, has run some numbers, and it's their clear sense that even if these horrible policy changes were to be put in place, they still wouldn't get you the savings you needed to fully fund the program. Just the funding levels are woefully insufficient. And then they also ask between these two accounts for the HUD secretary to have this odd smoke and mirrors authority to transfer up to $35 million from the 202 to the 811 account and vice versa. And just one more thing on the next slide on the 202 program, the HUD secretary does ask for the rental assistance demonstration to be expanded to include the newer 202s, and they do seek an increase for service coordinators. But if you're not going to renew all the 202 properties, I don't really see what the point is of asking for. Well, of course I do, but I mean, it's just ridiculous that they're asking for more money for service coordinators, but not enough to renew all the contracts. And then on the next slide, on the HOPPER program, the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS program, people will recall that last year, after many, many years of effort, the advocates led by the National AIDS Housing Coalition secured a formula update for the HOPWA program as part of HOPMA last year, and the FY17 bill got bumped up a little bit so that the programs funded by the old formula wouldn't be harmed by the new formula program participants. For FY18, though, HUD is seeking to roll back funding back to FY15 levels. It's a full $55 million cut compared to where the National AIDS Housing Coalition thinks that program needs to be for next year to expand the program to where it needs to be according to the new formula and to protect the existing program participants. So not I'll just end by saying this is not an acceptable budget for these accounts I just reviewed, and I'll pass the torch.
Thank you so much, Linda. Before we move on to our next speaker, we're going to take a few questions. So I'm going to hand the phone over to Sarah J.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah. I'm here with the questions and also a reminder. Again, we're really sorry about the issues going on at the beginning of the webinar. We'll send out a recording and the slides, and we'll also include the slide that Doug mentioned that wasn't a part of the PowerPoint presentation. So we'll include all of that and send it out to you. And a few questions for Doug and for Linda. There's really a lot of question and concern on how RAD plays into the drop in PBRA.
I'd have to go back and look at the request. I mean, there is a small, I was just looking at that yesterday. There is, RAD is budget neutral, right? So, when programs change their funding platform from, say, public housing to PBRA, but it should be increasing the PBRA account and not decreasing it. And so I'm not sure what the numbers are there, but say, any public housing authority, the Poor Public Housing Program, we'll get to that in a second, but the those subsidies, the dollars associated with them should be showing up slowly in the PBRA program. I don't know if, Doug, you have a better answer.
Well, I'll add 2 points. So on the one hand, the budget proposes to eliminate the RAD cap, which is currently, a couple 100,000 units or so. However, with the as Linda mentioned, RAD conversions are done on a budget neutral basis. So an agency's current public housing funding is what determines the base subsidy of their future rental assistance contract. And RAD becomes useless in a budget scenario where public housing funding is cut by almost 30%, because that means the funding baseline will be too low to really sustain rental assistance contracts and fund rehab. With respect to current units that have already converted to RAD, of course, those are all operating now with project-based voucher or Section 8 project-based rental assistance contracts. And so the funding for those units is, in fact, dependent on renewal funding for the Section 8 accounts. And to the extent that there are shortfalls in renewal funding for the Section 8 accounts, they could certainly affect funding for those current RAD contracts.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you both. I think Ed Gramlich also has an addition.
Probably shouldn't be talking because I just got back from vacation. I'm just looking at these congressional justifications, but I'll just throw this out there for people to explore further and to correct me. But looking at the project-based rental assistance congressional justification, it talks about transferring money from the Public Housing Operating Fund and Capital Fund to PBRA in 16 and 17. And I don't know if this is a typo or not, but for 2018, the request excludes an estimated $125 million transfer. So we'll have to dig into that and get that clarified going forward.
Great, thanks so much, Ed. We have some other pretty specific questions, so we'll answer those offline. But if you have clarification questions or want to go deeper into what Doug or Linda have discussed, continue to enter those into the question box. And also, as we continue going with our future speakers, certainly keep that coming. Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And with that, we'll move on to our next speaker, Tess Hembree, who will talk about public housing and formula block grant programs.
Thank you. And I apologize on the outset. There's construction right outside of my window, so I think I'm going to introduce a little bit of bandsaw into our audio problems, so sorry about that. So looking at public housing under the President's budget, the operating fund and the capital fund are both hit pretty devastatingly by cuts. Focusing first on the operating fund, all of the policy provisions regarding rent that we talked about with the voucher program apply to public housing as well. So the ban on utility reimbursements, the mandatory minimum rent, increased maximum rent contributions, all would apply to the public housing residents as well. And we don't believe that it would cover the proposed cuts to the operating fund, which would be $500 million for fiscal year 18 if the President's budget is implemented. That's an 11% cut, and it wouldn't give housing authorities the funding that they need to operate public housing. In addition, the capital fund is hit pretty terribly as well. The proposed funding level for fiscal year 18 is a total of $628 million, which is a devastating $1.31 billion lower than the current funding levels. This is particularly a harsh cut to the capital fund because the maintenance backlog was estimated to be about $26 billion in 2010, which of course is 7 years ago. And it's been accruing at a rate of about $3 billion per year. So even with current funding levels, the accrual rate is not being met with appropriations. So cutting it to $628 million is going to dramatically increase the number of units lost per year and the impact on residents who are living in units that no longer can be maintained. Moving on to the community development programs on the next slide. As bad as public housing looks, community development looks even worse in the President's budget. The budget calls to completely eliminate both the home program and the community development block grant, or CDBG. The budget includes language that says that the federal government should devolve community and economic development to the state and local level, and it redirects federal resources to other activities. So the federal government under the President's budget is completely stepping back from any role in funding community development and handing that over to the states and localities, which is an unfortunate proposal and is really going to strain the budgets of state and local governments. This is particularly harsh for CDBG and home. CDBG has been cut by 25% since fiscal year 11 as it is. Home has had an even worse time, 40% since fiscal year 12. The devastating impact that it would have on communities has been outlined in several pretty high-profile newspaper articles, so that's good. New York Times has done a couple about how CDBG touches lives. So it's good to get that word out there, what the impact would be in communities. Additionally, the home cut is pretty short-sighted given the housing crisis that we all find ourselves in. Every community of every size seems to be facing a housing crisis at the moment. Home is the only grant program that's specifically directed towards the production of affordable housing. So this is a particularly hard hit, and it'll make programs like LIHC even harder to use. So that's it for the CD program, so I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
I'm now going to turn the phone over to Steve Berg from the National Alliance to End Homelessness.
Hi, everybody. Steve Berg from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I want to speak just briefly about the HUD homeless assistance programs. For people who aren't familiar with homeless assistance, also known as the McKinney-Vento programs at HUD, they're about 5% of the HUD budget, and they're specifically focused on sheltering and moving people who are homeless into housing. It's established itself over the years as a performance-based program that incentivizes communities to come together about solving the problem. It's established a proven record of success and a record that both Republicans and Democrats on the Hill have been willing and, in fact, happy to support. So rather than starting what's in the Trump budget, I want to start with what we need. We who work on homelessness tend to be dissatisfied with the status quo, which is that 500,000 people are still homeless on the streets every day, and another 100,000 every month become homeless. So keeping things the way they are is not good enough, and we're intending to advocate for increases in this program this year. You can see the numbers on the slide. What we just got in fiscal 2017 was $2.383 billion. An increase to $2.6 billion would mean 40,000 additional homeless people get housed. We need this budget we need the bill that Congress ultimately passes to acknowledge the difficult work and the really excellent work that people in the field working on homelessness have done. The Trump budget, on the other hand, goes the opposite direction. As I said, we just received a appreciable increase for the 2017 budget. The Trump administration's budget would take that increase away and roll us back to where we were before that. That cut would mean 25,000 fewer homeless people housed in a context where we have all the people experiencing homelessness and more become homeless every time. We can't take cuts in this program. The administration has talked a lot about needing programs to be efficient and effective. We strongly believe, and we think we have plenty of bipartisan support for the point of view that these programs at HUD are exactly that, efficient and effective. The proposed cutting them anyway flies in the face of that, and we're encouraging Congress to do the right thing this year and get those as well as all the other important programs at HUD moving in the right direction.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. I will now move on to Sarah Michelson, who will talk about the National Housing Trust Fund and rural housing.
Great. Just very briefly, I'll touch upon this. The President's budget proposes to eliminate the Housing Trust Fund. And in its place, it puts a new funding mechanism that would essentially use the same dollars that the Housing Trust Fund would have used, but directs them to pay for salaries and IT upgrades at the Federal Housing Administration. Many of you know the Housing Trust Fund is the first new housing resource in many years, and it is exclusively targeted to people who have the lowest incomes. This also flies in the face of what the president's budget has said, which is that it aims to direct resources to where they're needed most. Well, we would argue that this is one of the programs of many that do just that. And as you remember, the Housing Trust Fund is actually funded outside of the appropriations process with a small fee on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Last year it was funded at $174 million, a very small amount of money, but an important step in the right direction. This would really hamper efforts to expand the Housing Trust Fund through other mechanisms like housing finance reform or an infrastructure bill. It also puts opportunities to expand it at risk. So we're not pleased with this, and we'll be working to push back on this part of the bill as well as many other parts. And I also want to talk briefly about USDA rural housing. Despite the fact that rural voters put President Trump into office and voted for him overwhelmingly, he did not spare their programs and those that serve rural communities. It eliminates many of the homeownership programs at USDA, including direct homeownership loans under 502 and the self-help housing program. It would eliminate loans and grants that help build farm worker housing in many rural communities. It eliminates the rural housing preservation programs through Section 515 and the multifamily preservation and revitalization demonstration. This means that not only has USDA not constructed any new rental housing since 2012 under the 515 program, but it also means it'll continue to lose its existing portfolio because it doesn't have enough resources to keep them rehabilitated and recapitalized. It also eliminates housing repair loans, cuts rental assistance by $60 million. While the administration says that this is enough to maintain current rental assistance contracts, it's really unclear how they're getting to that number. On the one hand, they have a new tool to help them better estimate rental assistance needs. On the other hand, they've been very reluctant to share information about the number of properties that have left their portfolio, and so it's unclear whether or not this decrease is caused by one or versus the other. I should note that these budget cuts come on top of a recent plan that was released by the administration to eliminate the undersecretary position for rural development. Many rural housing groups see this as a big demotion in terms of the priorities of this administration and are looking to appropriators to prevent this from taking place by adding language to any appropriations bill.
Thanks, Sarah. Sarah J., before we move on to the next section of our presentation, do we have any questions?
Great. Thanks so much, Elaine and Sarah. One quick question we had was actually going back to vouchers, if that's all right with y'all. It's about how the budget would affect portability of vouchers.
Yeah, so if you cut funding for vouchers as dramatically as the administration has proposed, agencies respond to this in several ways. The primary way is they stop reissuing vouchers and even terminate assistance for current families. And under the depth of cuts that the administration has proposed, we would expect to see a large number of terminations in 2018. But agencies also do things like reducing the subsidies, voucher subsidies for residents in various ways. And when you do that, that increases significantly the amount of out-of-pocket rental costs that households must bear, especially if they want to move with vouchers to neighborhoods where rents are somewhat higher. So it can have a significant impact on the ability of families to move using the vouchers they receive under funding cuts like this.
Great. Thanks so much, Doug. We're going to get rolling with Elaine Weiss, who's going to share with us some advocacy tips and opportunities so people who are, like us, really worried about these cuts, how they can dive in and get involved in their community and on the national level.
Thanks, Sarah. So, as you all are aware, many people are very upset and angry about the Trump budget that's been put out. And we want to give you the best tips for getting involved in pushing back against that budget. But I think it's important to note that we need to keep our eyes on the prize. And while we're all angry about the Trump budget, we need to also be looking at fighting the spending caps for fiscal year 18. And let me just move to the next slide, sorry, holding the phone at the same time. So right now, conversations are going on in Congress about what are the funding levels for fiscal year 18. Will they try to do a budget deal? Will they try to lift the cap? It's still very unclear. Secretary Carson will be testifying on June 8th before the HUD subcommittee in the House, so tune into that. But in the meantime, as these conversations are going on right now, what you could be doing is asking Congress to work together to lift the spending caps for fiscal year 18, maintaining parity for defense and non-defense programs, and ensure that housing and community development programs receive the highest level of funding possible. A phone call is great. An email is good as well. Tweeting, that could have some impact as well. But we definitely encourage you to reach out to your member of Congress right now as much as possible. You could also sign on to our CHCDF letter. We've already sent it up a few months back. We had close to 3,500 groups on it. We'd love to get more than that and send it up again. So if you have any additional questions about that, we will, in the email that goes out tomorrow, we'll have those links that you could do we already have some tweets lined up and emails and a script for you to use in your advocacy to make it easier for you. Additionally, we are working together with our members, national and state partners, mayors, and other elected officials around planning a housing day of action called Our Homes, Our Voices on July 29th. On that day and throughout the week leading up to that event, advocates across the country will hold coordinated activities calling for greater investments in affordable homes and community development. We're super excited about this, and we hope that you would like to participate as well. If you are interested in participating in our Day of Action, please email us at ourhomes@nlihc.org with some contact information, your name, your organization, who the point of contact will be, and the activities that you're interested in planning. What we're going to do is we have a website that we're currently building out right now, and we will populate that website with your activities on it that will help promote your activities that you're planning. It will be a great way for people to see what you're doing in your community. Some of the activities that you can plan are a rally or march, a press conference, a teach-in, a site visit, in district meeting with your members of Congress or congressional staff. You could do a call-in day, or you could do a letter writing campaign. Really, you could do any of these activities. You could do all those activities if you really wanted to. And if you have any other ideas for activities, please let us know. We'd love to get your feedback on different things that we can do to make this Day of Action better. The way that we will help support your planning efforts for the Day of Action, we will provide sample materials, including talking points, tweets, op-eds, a press release, letters inviting elected officials to your event, social media images that we hope can go viral at that time, posters that can be printed out, and of course we will assist in promoting your event so people within your community and beyond know of the good work that you're doing there. And here's a snapshot of the website that we are currently developing. It looks great. Like I said, we're very excited for our Day of Action, and we really, really hope that you will participate with us and really help us amplify our voices and make sure our elected officials know that not only are these cuts unacceptable, but that we need to be making further investments in affordable housing and community development if we really want people to thrive across the country. So we've invited Gabriel from Community Voices Heard to talk about his experience in organizing these types of events. Gabriel is a grassroots organizer who's done a lot of work getting people to amplify their voice and helping people who might not be used to doing advocacy work to feel comfortable enough to do it. So, Gabriel, we know that there's a lot of energy and a desire to respond to these HUD budget cuts that are being proposed by the Trump administration, and we're seeing a lot of people for the first time getting engaged in advocacy work. What's the best advice that you could give to people who are new to advocacy work or to organizations who are trying to engage those first-time advocates?
Great, yes, thanks. So, yeah, to start, I would reiterate your advice that you gave around putting pressure on your federal representatives and all the means that you said, and would add on to that list of, contacting them, what we call bird dogging, which is, finding out where they're making public appearances and challenging them on their stance on these cuts and investment in housing. And that's true across the aisle. We need to be putting pressure both on moderate Republicans as well as Democrats to become true champions of this fight. But ultimately, for individuals, your activism as individuals will be limited. So I think the biggest piece of advice I would have for individuals tuning in is to join an organization, or in some very rare cases where there's no organizations that exist, to start an organization. And you can do that by asking around first and foremost, but by also email that was put on the screen there from the National Low Income Housing Coalition about what groups they're connected to in your area. There's other networks as well, the Right to the City Alliance, that you can Google and contact them. They have groups all around the country, and our organization as well, Community Voices Heard. You can contact us if you strike out before that. And I would encourage folks to be thoughtful about what you bring to the table, right? And that's going to be different depending on who you are. If you're a person of means, grassroots organizations need money, right? Think about what kind of public relationships you can leverage and bring to these fights and plug into these actions that are coming up in July, right? What skills do you bring to the table? And I would also encourage, one of the core tools of community organizing for many years is what we call house meetings. And I would encourage pretty much anyone on this call, no matter who you are, to host a small meeting in your home, 5 to 15 people who you are connected with, who you think have, care about these issues one way or another. And have a simple conversation about why that is and what can be done about it, how you can plug into these national days of action that are coming up. And I think similarly, if you're part of an organization, I would say, again, think about what resources you bring to the table, connect those to organizing efforts that already exist. And finally, if in your city there is no groups that are really taking leadership on this issue, I would press forward in creating a no cuts coalition. That's what our organization decided we had to do, that we couldn't sit out this fight, given our base in public housing in New York City that, as you saw through the numbers presented earlier, folks are already getting sick, in some cases dying from the conditions. That's what those numbers you heard mean in public housing, at least in New York City. And these cuts impact so many different groups of people that what we found here in New York City is that a lot of folks are looking for that leadership, right? And we're really willing to come out and mobilize because of how it would impact their constituencies, right? So talk to your faith leaders, talk to your labor leaders, talk to the grassroots, talk to the policy organizations, and press forward.
Thanks so much for that, Gabriel. How do you connect people with other advocates who don't often use the internet? It might not be their forte. I know we have some members who we still mail them things. How do you connect with those folks?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to do that. One is to build relationships with groups that are already organized, right? And so that sort of list of different kinds of constituencies is a good place to start. Especially for actions in July, we don't have enough time to organize only person by person, right? So we need to build a relationship with a pastor who can bring in his whole church, right? a tenant association that can bring in their membership, a labor union, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I would ask around about which groups are really representing and doing real grassroots organizations and plug into those groups, right? And ultimately, don't be afraid at the end of the day to go knock on a door if this is an issue that you care about. Go talk to folks that are directly impacted about it and plug them into work that's already happening.
Great. Another question I have is, how do you make sure your events also involve action in talking with elected officials? It's one thing to, go out, have a rally, but, there needs to be some connection to our local officials so that they know what we're standing for and what we're asking for.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, right? We need a lot of power coming from the street, and I think even, disruptive and militant actions. But that needs to be paired with a real legislative strategy, and that we won't actually win this fight without having real champions at the federal level. So I think if you are part of an organization, especially if you have a coalition in your area, you should meet with your electeds, right? And they should become part of these events that you're organizing, right? And they should play key roles. And you should, talk to them about how they can plug in and what a federal strategy looks like for them. How they can actually move some of their colleagues on the national level.
And we know that there's that saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You just had a big event up in New York. What type of visuals at events get the best media response? I'm sure you had plenty of visuals at your rally up in New York City a couple weeks back. What do you find just, grabs the headlines or make sure or ensures that you get the press to show up and cover your event?
Well, my favorite sign that I saw at the action we organized in New York was "Cut your hair, not HUD." And I do think that the use of humor is effective, right? People do like that. Very simple advice is you want to really make sure that the messages can be read from far away. It's a mistake a lot of people make, that you look at the photograph and you can't really see what's on there. And I'd also just be really clear about what are your demands that come across, right? And what is this kind of core messaging that you want to be there in those signs? But I think that humor more than anything will get spread around in terms of visuals.
I tend to agree. Final question. You've been giving a lot of great, tips and best practices. What is your one tip for something you shouldn't do?
I think that for many folks who are getting involved in the first time, there can be a nervousness, there can be a feeling of awkwardness reaching out to do this work. But I would really just encourage folks not to stay in that place, to think about how much is at stake right now, and how this moment really demands that we take a little bit of risk, even if it is uncomfortable. So that's really, don't stay inactive. Figure out one way or another how you can contribute to stopping these devastating cuts.
Thank you so much for that, Gabriel. So we're going to take questions till the end of the hour, and at that time I'll also put our contact information. If you have any questions, you could reach out to us directly. So Sarah, do we have any questions?
We do. This is again Sarah Jemison here on manning the questions. One question we had is about how housing authorities can engage their tenants and what the limitations are in doing this. And I'm going to give that one over to Joey Lindstrom, who's the head of our field team.
Hi. So there aren't a lot of limitations in terms of housing authorities engaging their residents on the federal budget. They can engage residents in public housing, and they can also engage residents who use vouchers, which is notable because so much of the engagement that happens with residents in public housing happens in public spaces, specifically public bulletin boards, common meeting rooms, notices on elevators, and so forth. With those residents who use vouchers, oftentimes one of the best ways to engage is through a mailing that goes directly out to voucher holders. That can include flyers and other information and so forth. Housing authorities aren't subject to, in terms of engagement, additional restrictions beyond what would be expected of most nonprofits in this regard.
Great, thanks so much, Joey. People are certainly asking plenty of questions, so keep those questions coming in. One question from Mary Evelyn. She wants to know kind of what is the process, both, obviously this budget itself won't be voted on, so what's the process kind of going forward? I know we've had this past year, but it took so long for a budget to get passed. So kind of could you talk about what the process and the timeline might look like? Sure. So as I mentioned in the beginning, and unfortunately that was when we were having some technical difficulties, the budget process this year has been delayed because of the different maneuvers that the current administration and Congress are trying to use through the budget process. So what that means is that the appropriations committees are delayed in doing their work because they get their top line spending number from the budget committees. They have a deadline that the budget committee has a deadline that they have to reach. That's May 15th. After that, the appropriations committees move forward with their work, which they're now finally starting to do. They're starting to hold hearings on the different subcommittees to figure out what their funding levels will be for fiscal year 18. We have, in meeting with staffers, it sounds like that right now the appropriations committees are going to proceed with the fiscal year 18 spending caps that are required by the Budget Control Act. Like I said, Ben Carson is going to testify on June 8th. Hopefully we'll have a spending bill sometime shortly thereafter. But given the timeline of when they need to get these bills done, which is the end of September, it's really tight. And they're not going to be able to get all the bills done in enough time. So they're likely going to have to rely on at least one stopgap funding measure until they come up with a larger deal.
And just to add in, we've heard that the House might try to move forward more quickly with their bill, but of course, at the end of the day, any appropriations bill is going to need 60 votes in the Senate, and that gives moderate Republicans and Democrats a lot of leverage in negotiating these bills. So I suspect we'll have many opportunities over the next several months to engage members of Congress, whether that's when they're on recess over July 4th or August. And we'll be in touch with everyone soon, too, about other opportunities that there might be. But for now, we think the best opportunity is for you to call your members of Congress as soon as possible to weigh in with them, and then also to put on your calendar July 29th for the Day of Action.
And with that, we will conclude the webinar. Thank you so much again for joining us. Again, this webinar was recorded, so if you missed something, don't worry, you'll be able to go back and watch the whole thing again. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.